first of the Mesoamerican civilizations, we would look to what's called the Olmec. From about 1500 BCE to about 400 BCE, that's going to be their heyday. They're going to emerge in this area, like I said, of what would be modern-day south-central Mexico. They're going to be known by archaeologists and anthropologists as being what's called the mother culture, or the mother civilization of Central America. Meaning all of the groups that come after them, most notably the Maya, later the Aztec, they're going to have a lot of influences from the Olmec. Olmec are going to lay a lot of cultural foundations that will be built upon and adapted. They're the first civilization, not the first people. There had been many smaller agricultural-based groups that had lived there, but now they're coming together in a complex society. Cities are going to be built near riverways. There are going to be some on the coast, but there's going to be a lot of inland rivers in this area, and it's jungle foliage, and that's the kind of geographic environment that they're going to emerge around. This is kind of, just to orient you geographically, the Gulf of Mexico to the north, and then these are some of those inland riverways. Much of the Olmec is going to be around the area of San Lorenzo, and that's where you're going to see some of the major temples that were built, or the remnants of those temples, and so forth. So, we're not going to go any further into the Olmec than just what we see on this slide. There's a lot more you could explore, particularly in their relationship to other cultures, but I wanted to give you a quick rundown of the economy, culture, and social arrangements of these people, the Olmec, that is. So in terms of economics and trade, what makes their society go as an economic engine? Well, they have numerous trade routes throughout all of Central America. It would spread far north into modern-day central Mexico, far south, maybe even as far south, they estimate as far as like what would be modern-day Panama. And we know this because you can find various types of trade goods. The Olmec are prolific makers of pottery. We find Olmec pottery all throughout this region. So we know somebody is doing some economic exchange. There's going to be the cultivation of latex rubber during this time. And those are going to be used for a variety of purposes, but one of the things they're going to create are these rubber balls, and they're going to be used in really highly competitive sports games, almost like later on the Aztec will pick up on this, and the Maya as well. It's going to be kind of like proto-lacrosse, if you're familiar with that sport. They're going to gather precious stones from the mountain regions, such as jade, which they're going to be forming into these really interesting-looking masks, which you can still find and excavate today, and they're in a lot of Central American museums. Importantly, their economic system probably goes back to their food production, which is based around the growing of maize or corn. Corn, maize, this is going to come towards the middle or / end of the Olmec time, but it's going to provide a staple crop. Also, beans and sweet potatoes, various root vegetables like yucca are going to be developed as well, and these are going to be very calorie-dense, rich food items. If you look broadly speaking at all global societies, if you go to the Americas, their staple grain calorie producer is going to be corn. North America, South America, a little bit more root vegetables in South America. If you go to Europe and the Middle East, it's wheat. China, East Asia, is going to be rice. These are the staple food grain items, and this is going to be no different with the Olmec. It will provide enough calories that you can build a civilization around. In terms of their culture, they're polytheistic. They have a priest class. There's evidence of human sacrifice rituals, something we'll see later on with the Maya as well as the Aztecs, the Inca as well, of human sacrifice. The thing that archaeologists will often focus on with the Olmec is going to be these giant heads, which I'm going to show you in a second, but the giant heads were pretty much lost to history when it comes to the Olmec. And they're excavated by the late 19th, early 20th century as people start going into these jungle regions and stumbling upon them and digging them out and excavating them, and now you can find them in museums. But they're like a real testament to the architectural achievements, and we associate these giant heads with the Olmec. Some of them are 10 to 12 feet high. Just incredible. They're going to build cities, but the Olmec are going to build cities in kind of a sense that we often don't associate with cities. We often think of in various Eurasian societies that cities are where you have large urban population centers. People live. We looked at this in the Indus Valley. We looked at it in China, Egypt, later on in Europe. The Olmec are going to build cities, but they're going to be more for the purposes of housing and carrying out religious ceremony. When it comes to day-to-day living, people are going to go back to their small villages and towns throughout south-central Mexico, and they come together for religious purposes at these ceremonial sites. We see at these sites, when they've been excavated since then, glyph writing systems. So this is kind of like a precursor to any civilization. There's going to be some sort of writing system that can reliably transmit knowledge from generation to generation. It can relate to the development of mathematics and history and astronomy and all sorts of things that will ultimately allow a civilization to scale up. Social structure, pretty much two groups. You're either in the elite group or you're in the commoner group. The elite group is made up of a priest, nobility, political class. Occasionally this will include skilled artisans who are maybe involved deeply in the process of the design and crafting of temples. And the vast majority of the human population within the Olmecs are going to be the rural farmers, people who are engaged in food production. That's, pre-modern society, vast majority always engaged in food production, just enough calories to survive and make the civilization thrive. So that's kind of a rundown of the Olmec, and they're the mother culture, remember, of Mesoamerica or Central America. These are their trade routes that kind of spread throughout what would be modern-day southern Mexico into areas like Honduras, El Salvador, the Yucatan Peninsula. They're going to have influences on the Maya. They're going to have influences on the Aztec. But those are civilizations that come along much later. More giant heads. So, we're going to pivot from Meso or Central America to South America at this point. There are two mother cultures of South America that are going to deeply influence the groups that come after them. One is called the Chavan, one is called the Nazca. The Chavan, just to compare them to the Olmec, they have kind of their heyday from about the period of 900 BC to about 200 BC. So they would have been loose contemporaries with sort of some of the late Mesopotamian civilizations. They would have overlapped almost perfectly with the ancient Greeks, who are reaching kind of their peak around 400 to the 300s BCE. The Persians in Europe and Asia. They would have been contemporaries of this. They even would have stuck around into the early Roman Empire, the Chavan, that is. So when there's all of that stuff going on in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, there's also this going on in the Americas. Chavan are considered to be the mother culture of South America. Much of what they do, the foundation of culture and economics and religion, that will get transmitted to later groups that follow. They're going to have a priest-king political rule where groups are going to kind of orient themselves, politically speaking, around this priest-ruler class. And these are not going to be mutually exclusive categories. Your priests, in many cases, could be your ruler. Your rulers will wield religious authority as well. There's going to be pretty big temple and civic building going on. And by the way, the Chavan are based, as you see off here on the map, in what would be kind of modern-day Peru, coastal regions, that is, of South America, and inland in the mountains as well. They make a kind of unique society that's built around this idea of compensating people with what they need in life, food, clothing, shelter, through their labor. This is often a unique concept because we often think of civilizations being oriented around a currency. Early Mesopotamia had the shekel, the Greeks had the drachma, and other civilizations in China and elsewhere. Currencies are kind of a regular thing. In some of these early South American civilizations, they're going to operate really independent of that need for currency, where people will pay their labor obligations to the state by working. Later on, the Inca will create a labor tax, which allows all of their construction to happen simply by the expectation that people work a part of the year for the state, and then they go back to farming. They do some early domestication of animals. This has some real profound effects for all of Latin America, is that there's not a lot of domestication of animals, period, in the Americas. When the Europeans arrive, there are some things, like, for instance, they'll find that the Inca will have domesticated llama. The Aztecs will have domesticated turkeys, but that's about it. Conversely, in Eurasia, in Africa, Europe, Asia, there's the domestications of chicken, pigs, cows, horses. All of this is going to have effects on the immunities of these groups. And one of the elements that historians have pointed to that may influence why there was so much death amongst the Native American populations is that because they didn't domesticate animals as frequently, they didn't build up immunities to the various pathogens that develop within really densely packed domesticated animal societies. And so the Chavan and then later on the Inca are going to be kind of unique in that they cultivate llamas, or they domesticate llamas for beasts of burden. The Nazca, they're going to follow later, a little bit later on the chronological timeline. They're going to be based more in southern modern-day Peru. They're polytheistic in terms of their religious system. They're going to cultivate maize, no surprise there. They're also going to cultivate cotton, and they're going to create, fine linens that are going to be later picked up and used by later civilizations that follow. The thing we often remember the Nazca for, that they get a lot of attention and traction in pop culture today, is they have these trophy heads, or as they're called later by anthropologists and archaeologists, and geoglyph lines that can be observed from the sky. So let me show you these just in a moment here. The trophy head's kind of interesting. It's gathered that after warriors defeat people in battle and decapitate their enemies, that these heads would be taken and preserved in some sort of early embalming mechanism. They'd be outfitted in some cases with ropes to where they could be carried around in this trophy sense. You've got this rope kind of protruding from the skull that you see here. And then there's some skin tissue and so forth that's retained. So you're not looking at just a human skull, which would be quite ordinary, but you have this early proto-embalming going on in the drier mountainous climates of Peru. That can kind of be maintained. You get these trophy heads. Also, elaborate ceremonial burial rituals where people are buried kind of in this crouched, sitting up position. Oftentimes they'll be surrounded with objects that were important to them in life, so we know there's ceremony and processes surrounding the issue of death. But you also have what are called the Nazca lines. These are found in some of the valley regions of Peru. You get sort of these images of beings, human-like looking things. You have, animals. In this case, you have a spider here, and they're only visible through aerial photography. So they're not really discovered and highlighted that much until the 1920s and the beginnings of commercial aviation. People start flying over Peru and looking down, and they're seeing these constructed spatial images that are only visible from the sky, which inevitably, of course, leads to a lot of TV shows now about space aliens did it, or what were they trying to communicate with, and you can build a lot of, interesting TV shows around that. In reality, they have kind of demonstrated and reconstructed how these could have been done. Basically, different groups of people, fixed points, long ropes, which we know the Nazca would have been able to construct, and they were a civilization that sort of monitored the movements of celestial bodies, the stars, the planets, and so forth. So if their religious system is tied up in these celestial bodies and the monitoring of their changes, it's not that big of a jump to understand why they create images that would be seen from the sky. So that would be the Nazca. Again, the two mother civilizations of South America, the Chavan and the Nazca, both kind of based out of modern-day Peru. So we're going to pivot back to Central America. This would be the area around the Yucatan Peninsula, on the Gulf of Mexico and on the bordering the Caribbean Sea. Mayan civilization is going to be based here. It's going to stretch, broadly speaking, from around 2000 or so BC. You're going to have people living here. They're not going to be unified necessarily in one civilization, all the way up into around the year 1500. Again, people living there, but much of the Mayan civilization, as we understand it, is going to kind of die out by the 800s or 900s AD. They're going to be deeply influenced by the Olmec. Remember, the Olmec are the mother culture of Central America. They're going to engage in massive temple building and city construction. We'll see some images of that in a second. But the Maya uniquely are never fully grouped and integrated into one unified political empire. It's sort of a broad collection of peoples, city-states. They come together for religious purposes. They're unified through various economic networks. But there's never one instance where the Maya are totally unified under the political rule of one emperor that can wield power from one end to the other. This is the city of Tikal in present-day Guatemala. It's going to be one of the most famous Mayan sites in terms of religious and political rule. You see a number of pyramids constructed here for religious and calendar rituals. You see these competitive sports arena courts type things where they have those competitive rubber ball games I was talking about earlier. And these have been excavated. In terms of Mayan religion, polytheistic as well. The early Maya, they worship a number of gods based on nature. Things like rain, god related to maize or corn. Priests are going to worship a god Itzamana, the god of the heavens, so there's going to be kind of a hierarchy of gods in Mayan society, not unlike what you would see in other civilizations. But the key element here is that they're polytheist. A lot of their gods are rooted on behaviors and things witnessable in nature, and that are key parts of maintaining their civilization. Technology. This is something that we often think of when we think of the Maya. This has got a lot of attention a number of years ago in terms of the Mayan calendar. They were very mindful of astronomical events and the study of astronomy. They studied the stars, the movements of planets, the positions at different times of the year. They create a calendar around this as early as 500 BCE. And they're able to develop a calendar, interestingly, that has predictive value. They can predict solar and lunar eclipses. And this is all in the several centuries BC. The calendar is also very much rooted in their religious practice and the various rituals that have to be performed throughout a cycle of 260 days. So that's one calendar. Then they also have the solar year calendar, which had 365 days and was almost as accurate as what we use today. It's not until well into the 20th century that it's sort of eclipsed as a reliable mechanism for keeping track of time. They're advanced in mathematics and astronomy. I just mentioned this, the most accurate calendar could predict solar and lunar eclipses. If you look to the image on the right, this pyramid, which is at Tikal, it's used as a calendar. It has 4 sets of stairways going up each side, and each has 91 steps and a platform at the top, making 365 equivalent to the number of days in their solar calendar, which, again, is remarkably accurate. Their government and economic system. Do not put down what you see on the left. These are standard categories you'd find really in any society. What you should be more interested in is the social structure on the right. We're going to be doing an activity tomorrow in small group that will ask you to call upon this. So, in Mayan society, you're born into a fixed social class. There's not a whole lot of movement. We'll see with the Aztec, there's some area for movement. Not so much with the Maya. Much of the human resource production is going to be geared around farming, no surprise there. And there are going to be farmers, however, that can be conscripted into military service. So maybe part of the year you're serving as a farmer, growing your maize, and then if there's some sort of clash with the local city-state, you can be called and mustered into service, much like a militia, by a professional class of officers or governmental workers who serve to kind of organize the army. Slaves, there was a slave labor system with the Maya, as well as later on with the Aztecs, where you could take your captured enemy and put them into some sort of slavery or tribute status, as well as criminals who could be, put in the custody of the political authorities. And you're going to have this standard range. On the left, this is your kind of ranking system. You have a nobility class, a religious class. Sometimes those are not mutually exclusive. You have a sort of merchant artisan class, maybe carving out a better existence, materially speaking, as well as farmers and slaves. In terms of Mayan economics, they trade throughout much of the same area that the Olmec are going to trade, all throughout Central America. This would be modern-day southern Mexico, the various Central American states that we would witness today. Based on agriculture, they will use a lot of the lowlands to produce basically for farming purposes, but also produce from the sea as well. The highland region, there's some mountainous region near the Gulf of Mexico. Those are going to be used for quarry purposes. There's going to be valuable stones that are going to be used. Other stones in construction are going to be harvested as well. And we know that merchants are traveling around because we can find Mayan artifacts. Just like with the Olmecs, you'll see the transmission of various forms of pottery throughout the region that could be then linked back to what we see in, say, Tikal or one of the other city-states on the Yucatan where the Mayans are based. They carry their goods, merchants would, that is, in packs. They can travel on canoes. There's plenty of inland waterways in this region. They use terrace farming. That's not unique to the Mayans. Any time you have a civilization that's in a hilly or mountainous area, if they can maximize the farming potential of that area by carving into the hillsides, you've probably seen this before, the Inca are going to be the most famous at it. They will use that to produce things like maize and beans and other root vegetables. They're also going to practice what's called slash and burn agriculture, where essentially you have a part of the jungle that you want to cultivate for food, so you cut it down, you burn the remaining foliage, and it leaves the soil in a very enriched position. You plant there, you harvest there, and then you continue on and you slash and burn other parts of the jungle. Because it's tropical foliage, it regrows relatively quick, so by the time you get several generations of a territory slashed and burned, planted and harvested, you're back to the place where you started and the foliage has regrown. The cacao bean was prized. This is the kind of beginnings of early chocolate that the Spanish are going to find really remarkable and revolutionary. So, we're going to pivot now from the Maya to the Aztec. So, if you want to get a little jump on that. The Aztec is going to be based somewhat close to what the Mayans will be. Mayans are going to be more based on the Yucatan Peninsula. The Aztecs are going to be based in south-central Mexico around modern-day Mexico City. It's the Aztecs that are going to be relatively recent in the sense that they're hitting their peak as a civilization in the decades and centuries leading up to the European settlement and contact and the Spanish conquest. It's going to be the Aztecs that have the misfortune of colliding with the Spanish in the 15 teens and 20s. So they have their run from about 1200 AD or CE to the 1520s when the Spanish show up and largely destroy their civilization. They're based in south-central Mexico. The people who become the Aztecs are known as the Mexicans. They start out as a kind of poor, nomadic people, but they're going to become a fierce warrior class. They begin as a civilization, starting out as mercenary for-hire soldiers. They're going to hire themselves out to local war chiefs and city-state political leaders who need military personnel to fight and win battles. And this is going to be the nucleus for the people that become Aztec civilization. They're going to build a capital city called Tenochtitlan. This is going to be the famed city that the Spanish will see in the 1520s and just be blown away by its spectacular vastness and exquisite beauty. We're going to explore that in a bit. So, in the 1320s, that's when Tenochtitlan kind of begins as an entity here. The Aztec are going to build from there. This city is going to become so productive in terms of its food production and its political unity and its temple building and a number of other elements that it's going to be a thriving metropolis by the time you get to the Spanish. And I want to stop here and show you a short film clip. Thought I had it right here. On the Aztecs and how that city of Tenochtitlan operated, particularly their food production. And I'd like you to kind of soak that in and use it for this next activity we're going to do here with some text. So, Aztec civilization, very much rooted in this idea of making the most out of the land you have. They're built around an island in the middle of a lake in south central Mexico. There's all sorts of perceived difficulties that probably go along with that, but they're able to maximize their food production in that area, and it's food production that's at the core of their ability to grow and become a powerful civilization and city-state that can go out and conquer other people. So Aztec culture and social structure, they have a noble class, which is determined by birth. They do have a merchant class that are kind of ranked under the nobles, as well as the warriors. Warriors are going to be very prized in Aztec society because remember, they're a society that was built originally on mercenary work, hiring yourself out. So that ability to fight and conquer is going to be very prized in Aztec society. The Masehuales are going to be known as the commoners, the people who are engaged in the food production like you would have seen in that film clip, the people who grow and maintain those chinampa floating gardens, which they would have fueled and fertilized with human excrement, as they talk about in there. Floating excrement gardens. And the Mayeques, who are going to be the slave class. Aztec society is going to have a pretty significant slave class because they're going to go out and conquer neighboring peoples, and they're going to be kind of forced into either tribute status or working for the Aztec state. A member of the common class, however, does have some possibility for, I guess you could say, advancement available to them, and that they can always go and serve in the military. And if they're a good warrior, you could kind of advance yourself on some degree of merit or on your skill set. So in a way, Aztec society is a little bit more fluid than we've seen with previous societies. Okay, I'm going to leave that up for a minute, and I'll just kind of introduce what we're going to be doing next. It's going to be very similar to analyzing that piece of text that we looked at last week. Same kind of things going to be going on. Each of you has, or not each of you, you have a number near you, and you probably are sitting next to someone who's congregated around that number. Ideally, you're going to just work with a partner who's around that number you have. There's not one directly in front of you. You can join in as a third person to another kind of group entity here. So what I'm going to show you here is what I think is one of the most remarkable descriptions of Aztec society. It's kind of unique because this is captured and it's a snapshot of history that we often don't get with some of these early Latin American societies. This is a description by a Spaniard who arrives in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, in the 1520s, Bernal Diaz de Castillo. He arrives in Tenochtitlan along with Hernan Cortez, the famed conqueror of the Aztecs. And the Aztecs bring in the Spaniards into their city. And they kind of walk them around, and they're able to observe this, all of this kind of peak state. And this observation, I'm just going to read it out loud to you, and your task is this. Develop an essential sentence from the perspective of Diaz. So write it in his perspective, in his voice, that conveys essentially what he's trying to communicate in his description. And you condense it down to one essential sentence. That's what you need to do with your partner around your number. And just like last week, I'm going to call your number, and you're going to share out some. Make sure you have something. Right now, just observe for key lines, passages, words that you could potentially use in that essential sentence. And when we saw those cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, and that straight and level causeway leading to Tenochtitlan, we were astounded. These great towns and quays and temples and buildings rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision from the tale of Amidis. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream. It is not surprising, therefore, that I should write in this vein. It was all so wonderful that I do not know how to describe this glimpse of things never heard of, seen, or dreamed of before. And when we entered the city of Iztapalapa, the site of the palaces in which they lodged us, they were very spacious, well built, of magnificent stone, cedar wood, and the wood of other sweet-smelling trees, with great rooms and courts which were a wonderful sight, and all covered with the awnings of woven cotton. When we had taken a good look at all of this, we went to the orchard and garden, which was a marvelous place, both to see and walk in. Then there were birds of many breeds and varieties which came into the pond. I say again that I stood looking at it. and thought that no land like it would ever be discovered in the whole world. But today, all of that I saw is overthrown and destroyed. Nothing is left standing. Take a couple minutes. See if you can condense that into an essential sentence. Be prepared to share. Again, be prepared if you're called upon to read what you have. I would write this essential sentence in your notes. It's very likely an excerpt of this passage will come back at a later point. Essential sentence. The more succinct, the better. You can use some of the same language. Feel free, but let me use your own words. Okay, I still see a handful of people writing. I'll let you round out those sentences. I'm just going to call a handful of random numbers. You should have a product ready to share out. We're not exactly moving mountains here. This is a sentence. Number 19. No one's sitting. 22. Okay. They were amazed. Okay, that's a good kind of like narration description. But does anybody raise your hand if you actually wrote it in the perspective of Diaz, the guy who's writing it here? Okay. Jean-Luc, go ahead and share out. I'm not calling your number, but you raised your hand. Go ahead.
Okay. Everywhere I looked, the beauty always amazed me.
Everywhere I look, the beauty always... Yeah, that's a big part of what he's doing here. The first two paragraphs especially is just one thing after the other of how this is like one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen. Number 42.
That's me again.
Oh, wow.
I got picked last week, too.
Oh, wow.
He was in
It's like a...
surprised how advanced they were.
Say that again.
He was in awe and surprised at how advanced they were.
Okay, yeah, there's an element of surprise here, and this is one of the reasons I chose this passage of text, is because it forces us into the mindset of, oftentimes we can fall into that narrative of Spanish show up, they have superior technology, they overwhelm the natives of Central and South America, and to be sure there is an element of superior technology. We'll get into that, particularly as it relates to military, on Thursday. But you're also dealing with an amazingly complex and exquisitely designed, beautiful civilization that achieves a lot of things perhaps that Diaz would be even unfamiliar with or believe surpassed in Europe. I mean, he's basically saying this is the most beautiful place I've ever seen. So that's a key element there, is that Europeans are wowed and amazed by what they see. Now, Aztec civilization will be destroyed, as will the Incas, for a number of reasons. The fact that these civilizations don't live on does not really diminish their capacity or grandeur at the time. Number 50. 50. Way to own up to it. Go ahead. When we arrived, everything was beautiful and magnificent. Then it was destroyed. Yeah. One more. 38. Go ahead. What I'm seeing or what I saw was unbelievable. Like nothing before. Yeah, that's a big part of this. All right, so don't be surprised if you see this later. I bring this up because it's a unique snapshot into the Aztecs captured by Europeans, but it's also capturing at a point before the European settlement and conquest is really underway. It's that brief moment where you have that tantalizing possibility that maybe these two groups could maybe coexist or learn from each other in a peaceful way. Marshall, you can go back there. Not that that's really bothering me. Okay, so we're moving on here. This is a famous painting by the Mexican artist Diego Rivera. He was a very prominent Mexican painter in the early to mid-20th century. And he did this image of what Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, would have looked like at its peak. You notice the lake, the causeways, the canals, the palaces, the people, the markets. All of that is thriving, and the Spanish walk right into this in the 15 teens. So the Aztec social pyramid, just kind of a rehash of what we saw. You have a small, tiny sliver of royalty, nobility, a warrior class, as well as a large commoner and slave class. But notably, the warrior class in Aztec society swelled a little bit beyond what we might normally expect. They're often at war. One more interesting thing I want to leave you with is when the Spanish do arrive and meet the Aztecs, they arrive right after the Aztecs had just completed a very violent civil war. There it is. A very violent civil war, which a new political ruler managed to win out in. That's the ruler was Moctezuma, and he was one of the key players who kind of interacts with Cortez and the Spaniards when they arrive. But the Aztecs were kind of in a somewhat weakened state, even though they had prevailed and they had kind of won and unified the area surrounding Tenochtitlan during this time period. They were in a very much weakened state, and there were lots of other groups that they had conquered that were willing to cooperate with the Spanish in the conquest of the Aztecs. So that's kind of a key piece of context there, that yes, there was a lot of grandeur and exquisite beauty of the Aztecs at the time, but they were coming off a really violent, disruptive period in their history. So Aztec religion. They're polytheistic, and to win the favor of the gods, they often make sacrifices, human sacrifices. I could have given other descriptions. There are several examples of Spanish priests who come along with the conquistadors, and they're giving these very vivid descriptions of human sacrifices going on or going into areas of the city where human sacrifices regularly took place, and witnessing and transmitting that to a later audience back in Spain. And in some cases, these would have been prisoners of war. Often this is the case. In some cases, it would have been people who would have seen it as a great honor to experience this human sacrifice. So putting to rest the Aztecs, we're now going to move on to our final civilization, the Inca. The Inca are also going to have the misfortune of colliding with the Spanish conquistadors in the 1500s. They're about half a generation later, so in the 1520s, the Spanish are confronting the Aztecs in central Mexico, south central Mexico. By the 1530s, the Spanish show up on the western edge of South America and will encounter the Inca. The Inca, comparatively, are a new or younger civilization, even though they have deep roots in the Nazca and the Chavan, which we talked about earlier, because those were the mother cultures. The Inca were relatively young. It was only in the 1400s AD to the 1500s that they had really solidified as a unified political entity. This would fall into modern-day Ecuador and the long geographical backbone of South America, which we know today as modern-day Chile. And the people who become the Incas, they're kind of a wandering nomadic group during this time period. They eventually coalesce and settle in the area of Ecuador or or Peru or Chile, kind of that region in South America. They settled in fertile valleys, but they're also going to populate the mountainsides as well. And they're eventually going to unify a complex and organized society known as the Inca. The Inca economy was based on agriculture, like pretty much all pre-modern societies are. They're going to make the most use of this agriculture by maximizing their food production. They're going to be very famous with their large-scale terrace farming projects where they carve into hill and mountainsides. They grow calorie-dense foods like sweet potatoes. They'll also cultivate corn and cotton as well. But the sweet potatoes are going to be the thing that really amaze the Spaniards. In fact, the Spaniards send them back to Europe for a number of reasons. They grow beneath the ground. They're very calorie-dense. If you could ever cultivate these on a mass scale in Europe, the thinking was it could feed a lot of poor people, which is actually what the potato ends up doing. It becomes so popular, not initially, but later on, long term, that it becomes over-cultivated and becomes susceptible to various types of fungi, which, amongst other things, lead to the Irish potato famine. Most of the Inca serve as farmers. A lot of people have to be engaged in this style of agriculture. They have a pretty rigid social structure, but it is unique in a number of ways. I want to highlight a couple of these reasons. They're divided into two classes, nobles and farmers, much like the Aztecs, but a little bit more strict because the Aztecs had this bigger warrior class. The farmers are the common people, and these common people organize their political units that are simultaneously also family units. So you have sort of these broad kind of kinship relationships where you're not only kind of governed by your local chief or administrator, but that chief or administrator might also be a relative. And you manage to retain kind of small local group loyalty on the basis of those family relationships. And in many ways, that's a unifying thing for the Incas. In terms of their government and their technology, there's a couple things that I highlighted in blue here that I want to emphasize. The Inca, while they're a unified political empire, and this is a really impressive thing that such a vast region of territories gets unified under one political rule, they have smaller units of government that are organized around, say, a family relationship. They create, in this context, a pretty efficient economic system, which is, again, it exists and operates without really lots of inputs relating to currency. The Inca construct a system of what is called a labor tax, or a mita, where a portion of the year you farm and you live in your local district governed by kind of your family relationships, and that's your home base. That's where you have most of your obligations. But then for a certain part of the year, you can be kind of forced to pay this mita, or labor tax, where you go and work for the state on, say, a big building project, or a bridge, or a tunnel, or terracing a mountainside, where you can be called into service for any particular means, and you kind of can be in a non-currency state where you don't have to exchange that to survive. As I said, if you look at the geography of the Inca, it's pretty impressive they're able to do this. They have an extensive road system that binds the empire together, of bridges and tunnels over mountainsides, really impressive stuff. They have an official language, Quechua, which binds people together at another level if you can communicate over vast distances. They found a system of schools, and their social groups are even identified based on the patterns of their clothing. They're going to have these other things called quipus, which are going to be these binded cords that you can pass from one person to the other, almost like a competitive track runner doing like a 4x4 relay that will communicate messages. Inca technology, they build without using mortar. They're able to make precise cuts with stones without some sort of binding agent to hold it together. So remarkably impressive, especially when you consider the geography. Their religion is pretty tightly controlled, but they do allow for some diversity and toleration at the outer edges of the empire. They're polytheistic, as are all the other groups we've looked at. And they believe that you need to please the gods for the necessary success of the crops. This would not be an unfamiliar concept in Mesopotamia or other parts of the world that we've seen. And finally, this is the last one, promise. The Inca Also believed in an afterlife. They had an elaborate ceremony around death and funerals. They find these burials, again, where people are buried in a kind of crouched up position, sitting down. They have a number of their objects surrounded by them. And you can find many of these in archaeological things that happened in the 1920s where they were completely undisturbed for like 1,000 years, or nearly 1,000 years, in this position. That's it for the Inca. Make sure if you didn't get something down here or you want to reflect on it, make sure you get it in your notes. Tomorrow's small group activity will build upon these. Have a good day. Exit to the library.